Good evening, everyone. I'm not going to use a microphone because I hate microphones. I just want to welcome you all to the Illinois Student Senate's gun control debate. It's great to have you here. Hopefully some people wander in and take a chance to hear it. The Illinois Student Senate is the voice of the student body. We're elected students from all the colleges on campus. We get together and we kind of work on different policy and advocacy issues here on campus. One of the big things that we've been working on this year is political involvement of our student body. We want to improve efficacy amongst students to get more people to go vote in a couple of weeks for the Illinois primary and kind of learn more about the issues. So some senators and some non-senators got together. We came up with an idea of a debate series on really key issues of the day. And the two debates we're doing is gun control tonight, and then next Tuesday we'll be doing, right, next Tuesday? Mm-hmm. Next Tuesday we'll be doing a debate on immigration. So like I said, welcome. It's going to be kind of a cross debate between our two debaters here. I'll just be keeping time, and then we'll have a chance for members of the public to ask questions to the both. So I want to introduce our two debaters here. Karthik Ravi, you want to get up and introduce yourself real quick?
Hello. My name is Karthik Ravi. I'm a freshman and I'm majoring in biology. I know biology, but I have a major interest in a lot of political issues. And I think the course of this debate, I can present my ideas and show a lot of you what I think.
Yeah, come to the microphone.
Yeah, hello there.
Okay, Brandon.
Yeah, my name is Brandon. You might know me from such scenes as the 75th comment in the comment thread on Facebook, arguing needlessly. I do voter registration and other activist stuff here, and I generally align with the liberal ideology, so I thought it would be appropriate to debate.
So real quick before we get going, I want to thank a couple people. I want to thank the Student Senate's Vice President next door, Sterno, Laura Saldivar, and one of our executive assistants, Tara, whose last name I don't want to butcher, so I'm not going to say it. Ask questions. So the first question that we're going to ask tonight is, should the United States federal government ban private ownership of handguns? So, Mr. Hudspeth, if you want to begin, you have 5 minutes to...
All right, I just wanted to start off with some statistics and paint a portrait for you of what's happening here in the United States as it regards gun violence, commonly known to as firearm homicide rates, is how we like to look at it. And clearly, you've heard the statistics in that the United States has a much higher firearm homicide rate than any of our highly developed countries out there in the world. In fact, these statistics often exceed double of the nearest country, which in most cases is Canada and Australia. In fact, as far as the unintentional firearm death rates, so not everything is intentional, as far as unintentional firearm death rates per 100,000, you'll see that for both sexes at all ages in 2013, it was about 0.225, and for the next closest country, Greece, it was actually at 0.10. So we are clearly surpassing a lot of these other countries. And as far as how many actual homicides this was resulting in, on the ground in 1990, there were 23,438 homicides in the United States. 9,923 of these, of which were known to have been committed with handguns. So that's why we chose the proposition tonight that the United States federal government should ban private ownership of handguns. This allows federal authorities and also local law enforcement officers to retain their usage and in the business if they need them. So as far as that, we also see other harms existing in the status quo. One of them being suicides. And on the average day in the United States, you see more than 100 Americans die by suicide. Half of these involve firearms. The literature shows that higher rates of firearm ownership were strongly associated with higher rates of overall suicide. And it just increases the risk of and the potential for suicide by making a tool that is made for pretty much the sole purpose of taking a life readily available. Handgun ownership is also specifically correlated with suicide. This is proven through empirical consensus among studies. Household firearm ownership has been consistently found to be a strong predictor of suicide risks. Every U.S. case control study has found that the presence of a gun in the home is a risk factor. And what we've seen also is that this risk applies to all household members, not just the individual that purchase the gun. The association, following observations in these empirical studies, they find that the risk extends beyond gun owner to all household members and persists for years after the firearms are purchased, that the rates of psychiatric illnesses and psychosocial distress are similar among households with firearms versus those without firearms. And so this presents a very continuous risk for suicide, as well as when it comes to kids. Guns in the home are unsafe for children. If they find a gun, they will often play with it or shoot it. We saw this in a study by Jackman et al. In 2001 through psychological studies where he put a toy gun and a real gun in a room, and where they thought that, and actually American homes and parents think that their kids are going to know the difference between a real gun and a fake gun or a toy gun, and so they placed a bunch of boys in a room, and they pretty much found that most of the boys, maybe 18 to 12-year-old boys, will handle the handgun if they find one. And so there are a lot of accidents that result from this. We've seen these, other than these unrealistic expectations, that hundreds of children actually die every year from this. As well, it also presents a soft power problem in the international scene when people look at our country and they realize that things are crazier. I know most of you, if you talk to some international student who has got this this perception of the United States, it probably includes a little bit that seems like, why can't we get our stuff together? Like, why can't we handle this problem when it clearly exists, and it clearly exists much more so than it exists in other countries? And so with that, we propose, there's been discussion in academia about having a handgun ban, given our high rates of handgun ownership here, and so, just a second. This is a utility argument, so you have to consider how much of a minor constriction this is going to be on American citizens who are now not able to enjoy one specific category of gun that happens to come with the added benefits of being the ability to be concealed, and how many lives we will be saving in this. And so we'll go into more of these details in the constructive parts of the argument, but this is a utility argument about how much good can we possibly achieve with this, and what is going to be the disconvenience to a number of U.S. citizens.
I'd just like to reiterate, my name is Karthik Ravi. I know I didn't speak into the mic earlier, so just wanted to get that out there. Now, to answer the moderator's question, it's important to keep in mind that emotion is involved with this issue. It's clear when we look at these mass shootings, there were terrible losses of human life. But there comes a time when we have to put aside this emotion and understand the statistics. And unfortunately, the statistics that were presented to you by my opponent were not clear, and unfortunately they are not representative of the situation at hand. Because when we explore these statistics, when we understand that the stories that they tell us, it becomes very clear that if we were to ban personal firearms, we are going to pose more risk to our society through psychological means and increase the danger that they face on a day-to-day basis. This isn't a position any person can rationally advocate for. So let's explore the first claim I just gave to you. People will be hurt psychologically. And the primary argument brought up by the opponent was that because there isn't significant amounts of gun regulation within the United States, there are disproportionately higher rates of suicide. But what's important to understand about this claim is that guns are a means to commit this act. They will not eliminate the act altogether. In fact, when we look at aggregated statistics given by the Center of Disease Control, it becomes very clear that in the areas within the United States with last amounts of gun control, we see that, yes, they do have higher rates of suicide, but with the areas with the most amount of gun control, it becomes very clear that while their suicide rates aren't as high, their attempted suicide rates are disproportionately higher. And this is a key argument we have to keep in mind. Because just because people aren't killing themselves, if they are attempting to kill themselves just because they don't have access to a gun, it becomes very clear that this is a psychological issue that needs to be dealt with through the avenue of mental health. This isn't something that can be targeted through gun policy, and to advocate for such is simply irresponsible. If we want to help these citizens, if we want to help people through these mental health crises, we have to look at that in that specific avenue. Targeting it through gun isn't going to work. But let's explore the next claim, that people will face more danger on a day-to-day basis. And this is fundamentally clear when we analyze statistics from both the Federal Bureau of Investigation as well as the Gallup poll. Because when we see over the last 10 years, the overall amount of personal gun ownership has steadily increased within the United States. But what we've seen in the United States as well is that the overall rate of violent crime has gone down. And this is key, because just because homicides have gone up, that isn't representative. I did speak louder, it's fine. What we have to understand is that homicides do not comprise all of violent crime. When we look at violent crime, we see that it's composed of things like muggings, theft, and even rape. So, if violent crime is increasing within the United States because people don't have access to guns, then simply removing the ability to have these guns is undoubtedly going to put these people more at risk. In fact, when we analyze aggregated statistics from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, it becomes clear over a 10-year period that the areas that didn't have a high percentage of personal ownership of guns and also had the most stringent gun regulation, the overall rate of increase of violent crime was over 40%. But in the areas that had the most freedom in terms of gun rights and the higher rates of personal firearms, it becomes remarkably clear that in these areas there were disproportionately lower rates of violent crime. That means that these areas, people were able to defend they were able to defend themselves against things like rape. They were able to defend themselves against things like theft and muggings. This is important because overall we want a safer public. And just because we can reduce these homicides does not mean that our citizenry is going to be safer. So when we look at these statistics further, and when I look at them further in these constructive arguments, it'll be clear that the only logical course of action that we can take is to simply stand against this notion of taking guns away from our citizens, because ultimately they are what is going to keep our citizenry safe.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that we've seen through a lot of the literature, and let me start making sure I actually note this more, is that as far as violent crime rates and the method of choice, it's clearly handguns. What we've seen is that handguns are used in 72.2% of firearm homicides, and that was in the 2006-2007 time frame, seen through a case study by Nicholas Dixon in 2011. And so this is the largest thing that gun owners can use, or not the gun owners, but that criminals can use as a tool to commit their crime. And it's the easiest thing that we can possibly do to stop this firearm homicide rate, as well as violent assault rates that include firearms. And so we've also seen that, I'd like to also expand on the other argument, that criminals are highly unlikely they'll commit as many violent crimes by switching to alternative weapons. Long guns are a separate category in gun ownership, and they're much more visible, and so this is something that's just kind of fundamental about handguns, is their stealth and ability to be concealed, which enables criminals to, I guess, sneak up on one another. And so I've heard a number of, I guess, points iterated by my opponent here about the danger that is going to result in this, but I'd just like to counter with what we've seen out there is a decrease in violent crime, and that might not, and he also brought up the gun ownership rate, but we've also seen other reasons why this violent crime rate would go down. The militarization of our police, the increasing capacity of our state to have a monopoly on the use of violence, we have cameras just everywhere, and as they get cheaper and cheaper and more easily accessible to be used by anybody that has a business or in any area, this has a deterrent effect on violent crime. But one thing that so this is also what has come through. This kind of takes a hit at his claim that violent crime has been decreasing because of personal gun ownership as far as what they saw over that 10-year period. But as well, the overwhelming kind of amount of use, I think, really highlights the overwhelming amount of use, 72.2% in violent crime. I think that shows that this is a key and the most favored tool, and so it's also the easiest thing to stop use out there. And on the bits that we've said about emotion, I don't really understand. I'm not really seeing much relevance to the whole thing, and this is whether or not we're going to stop this violent crime, and whether or not this is the most useful way to do it. And as far as the suicide bits, mental health is also something that needs to be addressed, and it is being addressed. But this has such a high percentage in suicide attempts, I think reflects the need to ban handguns because they're so readily available and as well they're used in so many suicides. 50%, I believe the number was. And going into other arguments, we haven't seen anything on the soft power argument that I proposed about how it creates this image issue for the United States, which is just kind of a colory argument. The presence of a firearm accounts for nearly all of the difference in suicide rates across states. And so with that, I'd just like to yield my time.
Okay, wonderful.
Mr. Husbeth, when you cross-reference data from the Gallup poll with the Federal Bureau of Investigation over the span of 10 years, it becomes incredibly clear that the violent crime in areas with low percentage of personal firearms and higher rates of gun regulation have significantly higher rates of violent crime than the areas with higher rates of personal firearms and lower regulations on guns. So how can you necessarily argue that less guns equates to more safety when clearly the evidence denies that?
The evidence is also dependent on other factors as well. Like as I stated, handguns are used in 72.2% of these. I think it's the actual homicide. Actually, no, it was the violent crime rate. So this is the weapon of choice. I'm not saying that this is going to result in the end of all violent crime, but it's going to decrease the risk and it's going to kind of calm down each of these interactions and reduce the overall homicide rate.
Again, that's an assumption that isn't based in fact. What I'm telling you is that the areas that have less firearms and higher gun regulations have more violent crime than the areas that have more firearms and less gun regulation. So just because you state that handguns may result in less crime because they are the weapon of choice doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually occurring. In fact, the statistics tell us the opposite. So please tell us how you're able to reconcile your belief with what the statistics are actually showing us.
This is another thing. This is a rural-urban divide as far as areas with less firearms and higher regulations are typically in more city center areas, which also follow that there's a lot of crime there just due to the high population, the population density compared to the more rural areas of the United States where it's much harder for people to commit crime just due to the sparsity.
But again, you're wrong there too, because when you look at cities with less gun crime and higher rates of firearms, these areas do have lower rates of gun violence than those cities with more firearms and less gun regulation. So again, even if your argument is that of rural versus urban, you still don't have a claim to make here. So again, how are you able to reconcile something that isn't represented in fact?
Because these statistics are not directly attributable to what we're talking about here as far as handgun bans. These are one specific category of firearms that are used, and so we're not saying that this is going to reduce the overall level of gun ownership. There are other guns out there, but I'm just not getting your point.
The point that I'm trying to ask specifically is that if you take away these guns from people, regardless of whether it's a handgun, whether it's an assault rifle, clearly there's a correlation that suggests that when people have these guns, regardless of whether or not you're in an urban area or a rural area, these guns do promote more safety. As stated, it's supported by evidence that's given by the government and has been cross-referenced by third-party sources as well. So I'm not necessarily understanding this notion that there's certain stipulations between handguns and assault rifles that psychologically may do some argument that promotes that guns equate to more violence. Let's analyze Mr. Hudspeth's statement. He's trying to sell you the argument that gun violence is directly attributed to the fact that handguns are used in crimes. But he isn't analyzing this data in context of the larger scale. When we look at what the data tells us, it becomes clear that in areas, whether you're talking about urban, whether you're talking about rural areas, the data is very clear and suggesting that when people don't have guns, when there is more gun regulation, there's undoubtedly more violent crime. This is a statistical inevitability. These are what the numbers are telling us. So for him to try and deny it based off of some assumption-derived argument is simply irresponsible on his part. But let's also analyze the notion that, let's also look at his suicide argument that he mentioned in his own construction. He said that when you take guns away, you are undoubtedly going to reduce the amount of suicides. But what I'm telling you is that it doesn't matter if you are able to reduce the amount of suicides. Because if people are attempting to kill themselves even more, regardless of whether or not they have a gun, then the impact of the gun is irrelevant. If we're removing these guns for the pure purpose of keeping these people safe from their psychological symptoms, then we're simply forgetting the fact that these guns are helping in other avenues. So to try and pinpoint this issue purely on the notion that this is something that can help psychologically is, again, also irresponsible. But let's also understand this argument that other countries don't necessarily look at the United States as solving their own problems, because when we look at other countries, we see that they have their own problems that they have to deal with. Specifically the countries that have banned firearms. Let's look at both Australia and Britain. Both of them have exceedingly high rates of violent crime. In fact, the Telegraph notes that Britain is considered to be the violent crime capital of Europe. In fact, in 2014 to 2015, their violent crime rate had increased by 22%. And in 2015 to 2016, it has already increased by close to 10%. So there's a steady growth of violent crime that is incredibly evident in these other countries. So to suggest that these other countries are looking down upon us because we can't seem to solve the crime in our own country is, again, irresponsible, because these other countries are dealing with the same exact type of crime of their own. So to say that they look at us any differently, again, is irresponsible. And with that, I'd like to move the rest of my time.
So my main point as far as suicide rates are, and I think you cited that attempted rates are higher in areas that have more gun restrictions. Was that your point?
Yes.
Okay, can you elaborate just a little bit more on that?
So what I was saying was, regardless of whether or not guns result in suicide, I mean, if you take away guns, these people are going to try and kill themselves even more. I mean, because, yes, rabies, but mortality rate isn't necessarily high. But the fact that it keeps happening over and over again indicates to us that this is fundamentally a mental health issue. So we can't treat it in terms of gun violence, because taking away these guns purely on the notion that we can save these people from suicide neglects the fact that these guns are helping in other areas.
All right, thank you for that point. But you agree that it does increase the propensity, like the ability for somebody to actually kill themselves. It is a more effective tool, yeah?
Sure,
so yes or no?
guns are more fatal, but again, that's irrelevant to the fact.
All right, thank you. So given that suicide rates among California residents who purchase handguns were more than twice as likely to die by suicide than those in the general population, given that there is proof out there that shows that you're more likely to die if you have handguns, is it not true that also if we remove these handguns from the equation, people would be much less likely to die?
I'm not disagreeing with the notion that these people would be less likely to die, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these people are more safe. As I had stated, the attempted suicide rates are disproportionately higher in the areas that have more gun control. So again, just because less people are dying in these areas, these people are more engaged.
All right, thank you for the point. But does that attempted suicide rate include the successful attempts of suicide as well, or is it just the attempt? Because
again, I didn't necessarily look at it.
okay, yeah, I wasn't sure either. But my point is that it also might be that because they've had more stringent gun control measures, that that has reduced the actual successful suicides and like given rise to a higher number of those that are just attempts and not actually suicides.
If you're trying to draw a distinction between whether or not a person actually killed themselves in a suicide attempt or actually survived, then I don't necessarily think you understand the subtle argument that suicide is, the attempt of suicide is undoubtedly very drastic too. So to simply remove guns because people have a higher propensity to actually kill themselves is irrelevant to the fact that suicide is undoubtedly a mental health issue and should purely be treated in such an avenue. Because if we remove guns on the pure notion that we can save people from suicide, then we are neglecting the fact that more people can be saved from violent crime from these other avenues that guns are providing safety to our citizens.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to go into the next.
In 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that in DC versus Heller that you can't ban handguns in DC, so the right to bear arms applies to the individual. How are you rationalizing going past that in a handgun ban?
Because you can amend the Constitution and you can allow for increased stipulations on specific firearms and other tools.
Any other questions?
Okay, so in 2014, the University of Chicago recently published a study stating where criminals had gotten their firearms from, specifically handguns, and they noted that they had not gotten from any legal sources. I think instead they get it from places such as Mexico or out of the state of Illinois. So how do you intend to ban handguns when criminals are just going to use criminal means to obtain those firearms?
So that's the point, is that if you ban it just in one city or not, it allows people to go to Gary, Indiana and buy those guns and bring them in. But if you ban it across the whole country,
if you ban it across the whole country,
eradicated.
though, wouldn't criminals still be able to find a way to get guns, though, and still be able to get those firearms from other countries?
So yeah, I'll say this and we try to keep the questions just to one per, but I appreciate. But the point is that it would increase the cost of actually introducing these handguns into the underground black market. And what we've seen in Australia is that when you do a large reduction and you make it very hard for these people to own handguns, is that it skyrockets the cost of these guns, and so that is also a deterrent effect on the people's ability and criminals' ability to purchase these weapons illicitly.
Anybody else have a question?
I just noticed.
Repeat the question, that way we can get it on video. Are you asking that is the same rate of attempted suicide the same when you have places without guns and places with guns?
I wouldn't say argument, but you're concerned that we're trying to present. So allow me to elaborate more on the CDC statistics. They didn't necessarily track, obviously we're talking about different populations when we compare different areas, but specifically when we talk about statistics, right, there's a certain threshold that we can consider where if we place some sort of policy, there's going to be this specific amount of reaction as that is. What the CDC data is telling us is that the rates of attempted suicide are far surpassing this projected statistical threshold. So that's clearly telling us that there's a far greater impact in terms of mental health than there is in terms of whether or not a gun is actually promoting some sort of psychological action. So that's generally the That's generally the conclusion that the CDC data was trying to drive.
George Washington once stated, "Firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself. They are the American people's liberty, teeth, and keystone under independence." And then Thomas Paine once stated, "Horrid mischief would ensue were the law-abiding deprived of the use of them." My question is, what's so different about the handgun that we should separate them and eliminate them when his founding fathers believed that firearms were a cornerstone of American civilization?
This is primarily a utility argument. You also have a right, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness here in the United States. So these people who are having crimes committed against them are also having their rights infringed upon, and the rights that we're seeing, that infringement, what my argument is from a utilitarian perspective, it's much more beneficial to try to address that than this minor inconvenience we're seeing from handguns, while people may still exercise their rights with plenty of other long gun alternatives.
Said that once the guns are taken away, that the government will have a monopoly on that, and we can have a more militarized government. What happens after that? Isn't that why we have guns in the first place? Isn't that why the Second Amendment was written, so we can protect ourselves against tyranny?
Yeah, and I think we've established in this country a pretty high level working beyond the ongoing issues with money and politics, a pretty good democracy that you're able to change and have progress in. So I don't really see anytime soon militia taking over the government. I think we saw a recent example of that not working out too well on a very far off rural area. But I don't see I don't see the possibility of anybody rising up against the government. I don't see our government becoming tyrannical.
When the Founding Fathers drafted the Constitution, they implied that citizens would have the means to protect themselves in ways where the government could not. And this is precisely what firearms have allowed citizens to do. I have consistently harped on the notion that firearms provide an avenue for citizens to protect themselves from violent crime. And when they don't have these firearms, they're put in increasingly higher amounts of danger. This is representative in other countries, such as Britain and Australia, as they have disproportionately higher rates of violent crime. Their citizenry is at danger. Their safety is put at risk because we have people that are in support of policies such as this. So it's important to keep the general public in mind when we drive this specific type of policy. In addition, it's important to keep in mind that we don't try and intertwine certain issues. When we talked extensively about suicide, it became clear that the opponent here was trying to pinpoint this notion of suicide as simply something that can be countered by banning these firearms. But as I will continue to advocate, these are mental health issues. These are isolated issues that cannot be intertwined with gun rights. Because by doing so, he's manipulating the emotions to drive a certain type of action. And unfortunately, that isn't responsible on anyone's part. So again, I ask the audience to keep in mind two very key facts. If you want to be safe, you have the ability to be safe with a gun. And if the government takes it away, you lose that right, you lose that ability. In addition to that, people have control over their actions. And just because we pass certain public policy doesn't necessarily mean a desired result is going to occur. There are always perverse incentives to government action and government regulation. And it's precisely for that reason that when we keep in mind that we can't advocate for a solution that would simply take away personal firearms.
So what we're talking about here tonight is how to best, in a utilitarian perspective, reduce the homicide rates we see, reduce the suicide rates we see, in a way that doesn't unduly infringe on the American people's ability to exercise their Second Amendment rights. And as far as the arguments that I've presented so far, we've shown that that handguns in particular are the weapon of choice for criminals. They have certain attributes such as stealth and the ability to be concealed and the rapid ability to be deployed and used. And we've shown also that we've noted that as far as it concerns suicide, that there is a much higher correlation between the successful suicide rates and the gun ownership in the home, that an individual gun owner's capacity might not be able to, they might not, use the weapon in any suicidal way, but it also presents a risk for anybody in the home in that it increases the capacity for somebody to take their own life. So this is about lowering the capacity of each interaction, whether it be homicides or suicides, to result in or any violent crime or suicide attempt to result in an actual suicide or a firearm homicide. And as far as it concerns other, we heard data about national level comparisons from areas that have a lot of gun control and low gun ownership. But I would like to reiterate that this is going to be a national policy, and as far as the international comparisons go, we see that the United States has a much higher gun ownership rate and has a much higher firearm homicide rate. And so by stemming this issue at its source, we've seen that the source of firearm homicide and violent crime is the use of handguns. By stopping this one particular easy-to-use weapon, what we're going to see is a resulting decrease in violent crime. And so it's whether or not you weigh this violent crime and the amount of it which results in a firearm homicide to this minimal ability of a person to exercise specific gun ownership on one certain area, where we've seen other restrictions of the Second Amendment and other abilities to bear arms. So it's this little burden and this small interaction in somebody's life versus saving lives. And so that's why, from a utilitarian perspective, and considering that we can amend the Constitution and restrict the ability of our citizenry to own weapons, as we've done time and time again, that it's best to target very easy to implement bans and address the weapons that are used predominantly in these violent crime and other firearm homicide interactions, and then this will reduce the amount of overall homicides in our country and address a lot of the image issues the United States has and an inability to discuss this issue and take appropriate action. And so with that, I will yield the rest of my time.
Thank you both so much. So that is the end of the first question. We're going to take about a 5-minute break to catch our breath, fill up our glasses of water, and then we will go ahead and move to the second question.